Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is cosmology and spirituality. My guest is Dr. Daniel C. Matt, a professor of Jewish spirituality at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. Dr. Matt is the author of a number of books, including a translation of the ancient Jewish mystical text, the Zohar, a book called the Essential Kabbalah, and most recently, God and the Big Bang. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you. Good to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you. When we think about the Big Bang, we have a view of cosmology which is now widely accepted within the scientific community, and yet one that differs quite a bit from the traditional Judeo-Christian view of the creation, or even some of the creation stories of other cultures.
In some ways, these are dramatically different. Mm-hmm. The Big Bang Theory, which I would say is accepted by 99% of working cosmologists, posits that the universe began from a primordial seed, a tiny point smaller than a proton, from which the entire universe flashed into existence. And this seems worlds removed from Genesis chapter 1. God said, "Let there be light." You might say in both there's an effusion and effulgence of light, but Genesis posits a God in heaven running the show. Scientists speak of energy and matter emerging out of a primordial vacuum. Mm-hmm. What could be further apart? And yet, what I suggest in my book is that the mystical interpretation of Genesis really comes very close in certain regards to this theory of the Big Bang. Specifically, the Kabbalah, the Jewish mystical tradition, speaks of a primordial point, a single point from which the whole universe emanates. This point, in fact, expands into a circle as the primordial point of the Big Bang began expanding and really has never stopped. Another parallel is an original oneness, an original unity, which has become fractured into the world of multiplicity that we inhabit. Kabbalah speaks of the breaking of the vessels, and cosmology speaks of broken symmetry.
So what you're saying is that although conventional fundamentalist types of religion have a very different view about the origins of the universe, that if we look at the mystical traditions, particularly the Jewish, but I imagine you would suggest that other mystical traditions seem to be much more in convergence with the contemporary cosmological picture.
Right, I think exactly. The point is not to become fixated on a literal reading of Genesis. Mm-hmm. The mystics in the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions offer a much more poetic and spiritual rendering of the biblical text. For example, the Zohar, the major text of the Kabbalah, translates the opening words of Genesis not as "in the beginning God created," but "in the beginning the infinite created God." So God turns from the subject of creation to the object of creation, which I think is not simply a heretical statement. I think what it says is that the God we imagine, whatever human conception we have of God, is really a secondary product. God ultimately is indescribable, or as the Kabbalah would say, is Ein Sof, the infinite.
Now we're beginning to throw out a number of terms, and I suppose we better start with Kabbalah, or sometimes pronounced Kabbalah, and define for our viewers what that means.
Right. Literally, Kabbalah means receiving. The Hebrew root kabel means to receive. And you could translate Kabbalah as that which has been received or receiving. That could mean really two different things. On the one hand, receiving wisdom from the past, turning to ancient sources of teaching, teachers or books, trying to drink in wisdom from the past. On the other hand, Kabbalah refers to something very immediate and spontaneous. you might say, putting yourself in a receptive mode through meditation, through reflection, trying to connect your divine spark, your soul, with the infinite source of being, receiving in that sense. And I think it's that combination of new and ancient, of immediate and past, that characterizes the Kabbalah and really helped to make it attractive to generations of spiritual seekers.
Now, let's go back once again to the Big Bang. It's a fascinating notion. In fact, you tell a wonderful story of how we even got this name, the Big Bang.
Yeah, it's remarkable that the term Big Bang, which now really is universally used, first came into use through a radio broadcast on the BBC in the 1950s. The BBC was interviewing a arch opponent of the Big Bang Theory, what came to be called the Big Bang Theory, Fred Hoyle. And he said that he was trying on air to come up with some put down of this theory. He said, well, this Big Bang Theory, trying to poke fun at it, but that name caught on. Now really in some ways it's a misnomer, because there is no explosion. The reason there's not an explosion is that an explosion happens within space, whereas what the Big Bang teaches is that space itself came into existence through this expansion. So one should speak of an expansion rather than an explosion, and really an expansion that still goes on today, though at a much smaller rate. The important thing is that everything in the cosmos, not only us and our planet, the solar system, the galaxy, all galaxies in the entire universe, began as this infinitesimal point, this cosmic seed.
It boggles the mind, you know. It's enough to make somebody a mystic right there. It's the essence of mysticism. All is one. And at the moment of the beginning of the so-called Big Bang, it really was all of it in an infinitely dense point.
It really,
and yet most cosmologists I'm going to assume, are probably atheists. They don't think of it as necessarily an epiphany.
That's usually the image we have of the scientist. You know, the scientist as nerd is the caricature. I think that you might say cosmology is the science closest to theology. And I think the greatest scientists, the greatest cosmologists, have a spiritual sense of their work. Certainly Einstein, Heisenberg, Newton. These people saw their work as part of a spiritual search. And I think today we're at a point where scientists and religious thinkers are beginning to find common ground. You mentioned that it's mind-boggling, and really the reason I worked on this book was that my field of interest until now has been Kabbalah itself and the Jewish mystical tradition. But in reading descriptions of the Big Bang, it struck me that this is more wild than the Zohar, than the major texts of the Kabbalah itself.
One of the interesting scientific aspects of the Big Bang is that the background radiation from a point in time that you describe as having taken place 300,000 years after the original Big Bang, the background radiation from that it still exists and it is picked up by our radio telescopes and seems to permeate the whole universe.
Right. This is interesting. This background radiation, it sometimes is called the cosmic microwave background radiation, or CMBR for short. This was discovered by accident in, of all places, New Jersey in the 1960s. What happened was two scientists were measuring, looking for radio waves in the atmosphere, and they picked up a certain static. They had a huge horn antenna, and they couldn't understand why they were picking up the static. They decided to clean out the radio antenna.
They thought that the pigeons had created...
They thought it was pigeon droppings that maybe was interfering with the radio astronomy. They cleaned it out. They still picked up the static. Then they heard down the road, about 20 miles away in Princeton, that there were cosmologists theorizing that the Big Bang would have left over this background radiation. Really, you might say the echo of the original bang, or the original expansion. And that's what they were picking up. This really confirmed it was one of the first solid pieces of evidence for the Big Bang Theory. And a Nobel Prize was won for that discovery.
And today, scientists are actively studying that original microwave radiation and noticing in it interesting patterns. It's as if, I think you suggest that maybe the template for the whole universe was set back in the beginning.
Right, these tiny ripples in time, they're called, and it was the Kobe satellite a couple years ago that found these tiny deviations in that background radiation, enough to explain how galaxies may have come into being from an initial small variation, how that could have produced conglomerates of matter that we know as galaxies.
It suggests to me that not only was everything in the universe coexisting in an infinitesimally small point at one time, but the pattern for all of the unfolding of the universe was in that point.
At a very early stage. I mean, what's remarkable is the cosmic oneness and the variety. And I think there's a spiritual lesson to be derived from that.
Yeah.
Sometimes, mystics fixate on the oneness and lose an appreciation of the wondrous variety of existence. On the other hand, I think more easily you can get trapped in the distinctions between things and refuse to see the underlying oneness. And really what we find in cosmology and in spirituality is that equal weight should be given to both, to a oneness and the wonder of the 10,000 things, as it's called in the East.
Well, if you start with the idea of the Big Bang and try to build a system of spirituality on that, rather than on the received traditions of the various religions, you might come up with something different than the religions that we have today.
Yeah, I mean, we have to be careful. There's a danger in basing your spirituality on any scientific theory. It may be that the Big Bang will be disproven. I think it's more likely that it will be enfolded within some larger theory, as happened to Newton. It's not that Einstein disproved Newton, it's that Newton worked only within certain parameters. And it may be that the Big Bang, even now, it's being revised and updated and corrected. But I think we're with the Big Bang for a while. What I'm really trying to do in my book is to say, let's assume that things began more or less as cosmology teaches. Let's assume the Big Bang is our creation story. Now that in itself is remarkable. You might say it's the first time that we have a universal creation story, in other words, shared by populations around the planet, and what's more significant, a creation story that may be verifiable. There are pieces of evidence now for the Big Bang theory. So it's the first universal and verifiable creation story. Let's assume that that's how things began. What kind of spirituality can we build that's in harmony with that? And how can we draw on some of the insights of the spiritual traditions within Judaism, Christianity, Islam, to construct a spirituality that will make sense, that will work for our hearts and our minds?
Now, a few minutes ago you referred to a term in Kabbalah called Ein Sof. Why don't we come back to that?
Great. Ein Sof literally means there is no end, or one could translate it to infinite. This, according to Kabbalah, is the ultimate reality of God. Now, I should say the Kabbalah does two interesting things in its theology, at least. One is to posit that ultimately God is infinity, that God cannot be put in a box, that God cannot be named or pictured in human terms, in anthropomorphic terms. On the other hand, Kabbalah insists that since we've emphasized the masculine so much in our tradition over the past several thousand years, it's useful to balance that patriarchal masculine view with the feminine view. So on the one hand, Kabbalah insists that God is equally masculine and feminine. The feminine nature of God is referred to as Shekhinah, literally the presence, the immanence of God. God is masculine and feminine. Ultimately, though, God is Ein Sof, infinite, beyond gender.
Well, there's a paradox here, it seems to me, because on the one hand, we're talking about the infinite, the absolute, something which is very distant and philosophical, and on the other hand, you're talking about, as I understand the mystical traditions, of a very personal relationship that we cultivate.
Yes, some people are really bothered by this notion of Ein Sof because it seems to undo the personal God. What I would say is that we need a personal God to the extent that we identify ourselves as selves, as ego. I think to the extent that we are in an ego consciousness, our picture of God will be the personal God. I'd almost say that the ego and the personal God prop each other up. To the extent that we're limited to being an ego, we also limit God to being the personal God. Occasionally, though, we see through the boundary of ego, and realize that we're part of something greater. And it's at that point that God as infinity or God as energy really makes more sense. So I'm not trying to undo the personal God. I think that's really needed by people. But to say that there is what Meister Eckhart, the great Christian mystic, calls the God beyond God.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reality of God that transcends our images of God.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Jewish tradition is very complex, as is every religion. We have the Kabbalistic tradition, and we have in Judaism the Hasidic tradition. The Hasidic masters, such as the Baal Shem Tov, it seemed to me, if I can challenge you a little bit, that they cultivated a state of mind in which the ego is sort of lost in ecstatic rapture and joy, but the relationship with God is still a very personal one.
Yeah, the Hasidic masters were somehow able to bridge these two realms. I should say, just to put Hasidism in context, Hasidism is the popularization of the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah was the earlier medieval tradition, somewhat abstract and esoteric, and Hasidism tries to convey that to the masses. Some Hasidic masters emphasize the loss of ego, the loss of self, what they speak of as nothingness, that one should melt into the nothingness of God. And they describe God also as the divine nothing, in Hebrew, ayin. Other Hasidic masters relate very personally to God, calling out to God, crying to God, arguing with God. Those are different tendencies, and usually it was different Hasidic masters that emphasized one or the other.
Well, Judaism is a very peculiar tradition in a way. When you read the Torah, there's a sense that the Jewish people are to set themselves apart from the other nation. They are to become a nation of priests. They are to obey 613 commandments that control how they dress and what they eat and when they work. And all of these things seem to be very special and, in a way, even for Jewish people, rather peculiar. Very different from the kind of universal sense of spirituality that I think one arrives at upon contemplating the Big Bang, and the sense that all of humanity and all of the universe were coexisting in a single point.
Right. I think there's really a tension here between, a creative tension, hopefully, between universalism and particularism.
Yeah.
You might put it this way, that Judaism exists in the tension between saying God is one right now, or someday God will be one. In other words, there's an ultimate vision of a planetary awareness of God.
Yes.
And the greatest Jewish thinkers, even of the Middle Ages, saw Christianity and Islam as part of this move toward a universal monotheism. But Judaism insists that that level has not been attained yet, and that there's still a need for a particular witnessing to God, and that's what the Jewish people commits itself to. Science, on the other hand, really insists on a universal language, and scientists pride themselves on the fact that people in India, people in England, people in California, people in the Antarctic have a shared language. There's no need for individual cultural difference. That may crop up, but it's not essential. In some ways, it interferes with the goal of science. And there's a tension there. I'm not trying to equate really science and religion or science and Judaism. I'm not suggesting, for example, that the medieval Jewish mystics knew what Einstein or Stephen Hawking would discover. But it's remarkable that we find in a 16th century Jewish mystic or in a 13th century Kabbalistic text certain formulations that are in harmony with contemporary cosmology.
Sort of parallel in
Right. Parallel tracks, at times intersecting, at times parallel, at times conflicting. But I think the point is, what can science and religion learn from each other? I'd give one example. Science can learn from religion to cultivate a greater sense of wonder. Now, the greatest scientists had this. As I mentioned, the great scientists saw their work as part of a spiritual quest.
Yes.
But science really can grow a lot in its appreciation of wonder. And there the religious mind, the religious sensibility, offers a model. What can religion learn from science? One thing is that theories are falsifiable. In other words, science progresses by proving itself wrong. by suggesting a theory or a hypothesis, investigating the data, and seeing to what extent that theory holds up. If a theory is disproven, that's not the end of the world. That's really progress. Religious thinkers seem very hesitant to disprove their own theories or to prove them wrong. And I think religion here can learn from the humility of science and assume that progress is made even when theories fall.
Well, your book, God and the Big Bang, was published, I think, by Jewish Lights Publishing.
Right.
And on the book cover it states, well, it's a book for Jewish people, but for seekers of all paths. And one of the things that you suggest to Jews, I think it's almost a critique of Judaism, is that there is more to be learned from Islam and from Christianity than Jews have been traditionally willing to allow themselves to glean.
Right. You might say because of historical circumstances, because of persecution, Jews have looked inward to their own tradition almost exclusively. And certainly for the past several hundred years, Jews have been more open, but usually religious teachers pride themselves or limit themselves to Torah, Talmud, Midrash. And one of the points I'm making is that obviously we live in a world now where you can walk into a bookstore and see a shelf on Buddhism, a bookcase on Hinduism, on Islam, on Christianity. I think Jews owe it to themselves in particular to be open, and here I know I'll push some buttons, to be open to the teachings of Jesus. Now, I'm not suggesting, I want to state this clearly up front, I'm not suggesting the Jews should accept Jesus as the Messiah. I think that's not an option for a Jewish spiritual seeker. But I think it's important to recognize Jesus as a spiritual teacher, as a source of wisdom, as a Jewish teacher who had profound insight, and to try to glean something from that wisdom, and to see it as a version of Torah, as an interpretation of Torah. That's certainly how Jesus saw his own work and life.
Well, it strikes me as a little bit fascinating when you think of the biblical injunction that Jews are to become a nation of priests. I can't tell you how many Jewish Hindus and Jewish Buddhists and Jewish people on the leading edge of many different spiritual movements. And I know within Judaism these people are not considered Jewish. And yet in some larger sense it seems to me that there's a spiritual... well, the image I'm getting is like a mix master. There's a stirring. There is a stirring going on. And the conventional ways of looking at what these traditions are breaking down radically right now.
Right. To continue your metaphor of food, I think there's a spiritual hunger that's part and parcel of being Jewish. And for many Jews in the 60s and 70s and 80s, Jews who weren't able to find a genuine spirituality in their suburban synagogue, they turned to the East. They turned to Buddhism. They turned to TM. They turned to various spiritual paths. Many of them are now, as aging baby boomers, coming back to the tradition and demanding some spirituality there. And it's a very creative phase right now because it's Jews who have tasted Buddhism, Jews who have immersed themselves in other forms of spirituality, not content with the normal diluted message they heard from their suburban rabbis, demanding more, in some ways bringing their spiritual sensibility, their spiritual appetite, and demanding that their own teachers and rabbis in the Jewish community rediscover these ancient sources of Jewish wisdom.
And
so
I suspect that this is also going on within Christianity and Islam as well. It's not exclusive to Judaism.
Sure. I mean, as I'm sure you know, in the book publishing world, spirituality is one of the hottest things right now. Self-improvement, but specifically a spiritual search. And this is a wonderful phenomenon.
I run into many people sometimes when I lecture, and I will ask them, how many of you are on a spiritual search? A whole room of people will raise their hands. And then I may ask, well, how many of you are involved in a religion? Not a single hand will go up. People, I think, have come to a point where they distinguish between religion and spirituality.
I think that's so. That's a critique of religion and a valid critique. On the other hand, I think now you have a substantial number of rabbis who are willing to experiment with meditation, for example. I think this is one of the great needs in American worship, in the synagogue, in the mosque, in the church, to bring silence. I don't mean empty pews, to bring structured communal silence into the liturgy, into the prayer service, to make that really to balance the words, Some of the words are outdated. Some of the words have just been piling up for millennia, and we need meditation to enrich the service.
Are you proposing that we take ideas such as the idea of the Big Bang and try and introduce that into the liturgy or in some way?
There are liturgists that are doing that. Matthew Fox has really developed a cosmic mass based on some of that imagery. The Reformed prayer book, the Reformed Jewish prayer book, has certain formulations on science. I think, you know, there are many Jewish scientists too, and it's worthwhile in a synagogue setting to have dialogue between scientists and spiritual seekers. I wouldn't insist on bringing the Big Bang directly into the service, but I think it's certainly food for thought.
Well, the fundamental notion that hits me is the notion of oneness. The Big Bang seems to be very explicit about it, and that's the fundamental concept of mysticism as well.
Of mysticism and even of official traditional religion. Right? Take the line in Deuteronomy, which is a central line in the Jewish prayer service. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Now what does it mean to say that God is one? You might say it means God is simply the only God that exists. But the mystics read it, God is oneness. God is all that exists. So that mystical insight, which is also a scientific, cosmological insight, is really common.
Daniel, Matt, this has been such a pleasure to be with you and to be able to come to the point of oneness just as our time runs out. I'm delighted. Thanks so much for being with me.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us. And please check your program listings for part 2 in this 2-part series on cosmology and spirituality. And in part 2, we'll delve even more deeply into the mysteries of the Hebrew Kabbalah.